The preacher's hands trembled as he stood in the dim glow of lamplight, his collar tight round his throat like a noose. Across from him, his wife's eyes blazed with a pain so fierce it could set the whole world ablaze. She held a letter in her hand, crumpled now from the force of her grip, and her voice when it came was barely a whisper, but it cut deeper than any shout ever could. She asked him if it was true, if the woman from the congregation, the widow who came seeking comfort after losing her husband, had found more than prayer in his company. The preacher's mouth opened, then closed. His sermons had taught 1,000 souls about truth and righteousness, but now, standing before the woman who'd walked beside him for 20 years, he found himself silent. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on his chest until he thought his ribs might crack. His wife's hands shook as she held up that letter, written in a delicate hand, perfumed with lavender, words that spoke of stolen moments and promises whispered in shadows. The preacher reached toward her, but she stepped back like he was a stranger. Her voice broke when she spoke again, asking him how long had he been lying to her, to God, to everyone who trusted him. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the wind moaned through the canyon like something mourning. And then she said the words that stopped his heart cold, that everyone in town already knew. The letter had been left at the general store by mistake, read by the shopkeeper's wife, spread like wildfire through every home and heart in the territory. His sin wasn't just between them anymore. It belonged to the whole frontier now. The preacher fell to his knees. Now, tell me something, friend. If you'd built your whole life on faith and righteousness, preached it from a pulpit every Sunday, held yourself up as a light for others to follow, and then fell into darkness yourself, what would you do when that darkness was dragged into the sun for all to see? Would you run? Would you fight to save what's left? Or would you finally face the truth that love built on lies can never stand, no matter how hard you pray for it to hold? That's the question that haunted preacher Samuel Hart that terrible night, because the price of his sin wasn't just losing his wife, it was losing everything he'd ever been. Samuel Hart came to the small frontier town of Red Canyon 5 years before that night, a Bible in one hand and hope in the other. He'd married young to a woman named Catherine, strong as iron and gentle as spring rain, who believed in him when he was nothing but a wandering preacher with dust on his boots. Together they built a church from timber and faith, and the people came. They came with their troubles and their tears, and Samuel spoke words that gave them comfort. Catherine stood beside him through it all. She taught the children their letters, tended to the sick, made their modest home a place of warmth in a harsh land. Samuel looked at her sometimes and felt a love so deep it scared him, because he knew, deep down, he didn't deserve it. There was something restless in him, something hungry that prayer couldn't quite satisfy. Then came the widow, Elena Marsh. Her husband died in a mining accident, crushed under rock and darkness, and she came to Samuel's church a broken thing, searching for meaning in her loss. Samuel counseled her, as was his duty. He spoke to her of God's plan and eternal rest, but somewhere between scripture and sorrow, something shifted. She looked at him not as a preacher, but as a man, and Lord help him, he looked back. It started small, a touch on the hand that lasted too long, meetings that stretched past sunset, conversations that had nothing to do with God and everything to do with the ache of loneliness they both carried. Samuel told himself he was helping her heal. He told himself it was innocent. He told himself 1,000 lies until the day he kissed her in the church vestry, surrounded by hymn books and the smell of candle wax, and knew he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. The affair burned quiet and hidden through that summer. Elena's grief transformed into something else, a desperate clinging, a need that both thrilled and terrified Samuel. He'd leave her arms and return home to Catherine, who smiled at him with trust in her eyes, and the guilt would choke him, but not enough to stop, never enough to stop. He told himself he could end it, that he'd break it off and confess and beg Catherine's forgiveness, but every time he tried, Elena's tears would stop him, or his own weakness would win out, and the sin would continue its slow poison through his soul. Catherine never suspected, or if she did, she loved him too much to ask. She saw the distance growing between them and worked harder to close it, cooking his favorite meals, sitting beside him in the evening, reaching for his hand. And each gesture of her love was another knife in his heart. Then came the letter. Elena had written it in a moment of panic when Samuel told her they had to stop, that he couldn't live with the lies anymore. She poured her heart onto paper. Every secret meeting, every stolen kiss, every promise he'd made to her in weakness. She meant to deliver it to him personally, to convince him to stay. But in her desperation, she left it at the general store to be collected, and fate played its cruel hand. Mrs. Henderson, the shopkeeper's wife, was sorting mail when the letter slipped from the envelope. She read the first line and couldn't stop. By noon, half the town knew. By sunset, everyone had heard whispers. And by the time darkness fell, someone with a vengeful heart or a twisted sense of justice had delivered the letter to Catherine herself. The town that once looked at Samuel Hart with reverence now stared with contempt. The men who'd shaken his hand after sermons turned away. The women who'd sought his counsel for their marriages whispered behind their hands. Even the children seemed to sense something was wrong, going quiet when he walked past. Samuel's church stood empty the next Sunday. The pews where families once gathered sat hollow and accusing. He climbed to the pulpit anyway, his Bible open, his voice echoing in that vacant space. He tried to speak of redemption, but the words died in his throat. How could he preach salvation when he'd destroyed his own? Catherine packed her things in silence. She moved with the careful precision of someone trying not to shatter completely. Samuel begged her to stay, to let him explain. But what explanation could erase betrayal? What words could rebuild trust burned to ash? She looked at him one final time before leaving, and the brokenness in her eyes haunted him worse than any damnation. Elena came to him after Catherine left, seeking comfort or perhaps vindication. But Samuel could barely look at her now. What he'd mistaken for love had been nothing but weakness and selfishness dressed in prettier clothes. He told her it was over, that they'd both been fools, that the cost of their sin had come due and the payment was more than either could bear. The town wanted him gone. A delegation of men came to tell him so, not with violence, but with cold finality. They didn't need to explain why. Red Canyon had no room for a shepherd who betrayed his own flock.
Samuel Hart left Red Canyon on a gray morning, riding out alone with nothing but his Bible and the clothes on his back. The church he'd built stood behind him, already beginning to gather dust. The life he'd known was gone, dissolved like smoke on the wind. But something happened in the weeks and months that followed. Stripped of his position, his reputation, his pride, Samuel finally had to face himself. Not the righteous preacher he'd pretended to be, but the flawed, broken man underneath. He wandered from town to town, taking work where he could find it, no longer wearing his collar, no longer speaking from pulpits. In a small settlement near the border, he met an old priest who listened to his story without judgment. The priest told him something Samuel never forgot, that being a man of God didn't mean being perfect, it meant being honest. The real faith began not in righteousness, but in the humble recognition of one's own weakness. That love couldn't coexist with deception, but redemption could still grow from the ruins of failure. Samuel never saw Catherine again. Though he wrote her letters, she never answered. He hoped she found peace, found someone worthy of her strength and grace. He carried his guilt like a stone in his chest, but over time that weight transformed into something else, a fierce commitment to truth, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. Years later, Samuel served a small congregation in a forgotten mining camp. No grand church, but a tent where lonely souls gathered. He never hid his past from them. He told him straight that he was a man who'd failed, who'd betrayed trust and broken vows, who'd learned the hardest way that love built on lies would always crumble. And maybe because of that honesty, or maybe in spite of it, they listened. Because the greatest sin wasn't falling. Everyone falls. The greatest sin was pretending you never hit the ground. And the hardest kind of preaching wasn't telling people how to be good. It was showing them that even the broken could still seek light. In the end, Samuel Hart learned what he should have known all along, that love demands truth, that desire without honor destroys everything it touches, and that redemption doesn't erase the past, it just gives you the courage to face tomorrow despite it. If this tale touched your heart, then don't ride off just yet. There are more stories waiting beneath the western sun. Tales of love, betrayal, and lessons learned the hard way. Stories of men and women who faced their darkest moments and found out what they were really made of. Subscribe to Frontier Love Tales, where every story reminds us that love still rides, even across the roughest frontier. Because sometimes the truest lessons come from the hardest roads, and the most honest hearts are the ones that learn to beat again after breaking.